One final game left on the slate for the 2022-23 college football season. I'm your host, Dylan Rubin King. I am joined by my guy, Andrew. We're here to talk about the college football national championship game in 2023 between TCU and Georgia. Andrew, how you doing, man?
I am sad.
Why is that?
I mean, I feel like that one guy that revolutionized NoContextCFB at that Kansas-Oklahoma game a couple of years ago, holding up that I am sad sign, because we have officially reached the final two games of the season. We only have the FBS national title game and the FCS title game coming Saturday, I think it is, whatever the day may be. But, we got two games left, but let's might as well just enjoy them. I mean, if this national title game is, even though Georgia did beat Alabama pretty handily in that second half, if it's anywhere as exciting as that game, I think we might as well just take it.
Doesn't it feel like we were just getting ready for Nebraska Northwestern like a couple weeks ago? Like, to me, that's what it feels like. We're still waiting for that. We're still putting out days until college football content every day. It's just crazy how fast this season has flown by. But looking back,
feels like only yesterday I was on the sideline of that UTSA UH game and I almost got ran over by Clayton Tune on the sidelines. I honestly missed that day. It's been a pretty emotional roller coaster, but the way that I've kind of viewed this season is, while we are sad it's gone to this point, I think it's been super enjoyable this whole season. We've had chaos almost every weekend, and it had a nice tempo. I feel like there are times where it's like, when it comes to a season's end, we're like, oh my God, I want to end the season end. But truthfully, when it comes to this past season, I think I've enjoyed almost every facet of this season, in terms of underdogs that came out, in terms of excitement that we've had throughout the season, the upsets that we've had. This has honestly been such a full football season that had everything that you've really wanted. Even though I'm obviously sad that it's coming to an end, I have a much greater appreciation of what we've witnessed this year than I think I have in a long time.
There were three words that you used in that elaborate, just beautiful sentiment of the 2022 season that you used, that were tempo, chaos, and underdog. And those can all describe TCU, a team that went 5-7 last year. And in their first year under Sonny Dykes, they're in the national championship game, looking for their first title since 1938. So let's dive into it a little bit. We talked about TCU as a chaotic team, and that's exactly what they've been all season long. They started out unranked. Chandler Morris was their starting quarterback, if you can believe it, against Colorado. New offensive coordinator, new defensive coordinator, new head coach, transfers all over the place. Like, we had no idea what to expect from this TCU team. And once the calendar hit October, man, they were just rolling through ranked opponent after ranked opponent. I believe it was 4 in a row that they won. And that was the first time since 2012 Stanford, I believe, the first time anyone had ever done that. And they just kept on rolling. The Big 12 championship game, obviously their only loss, but having lost to a team that they already beat about a month and a half before, was good enough to get them into the playoff. And then, man, that Fiesta Bowl was electric against Michigan. One of the best games of the year, regardless of bowl season, regular season. That was a phenomenal football game. So what's your take on this TCU team? I know you follow Big 12 closely. You're a Texas guy. So what's your take on this team from start to finish?
A couple things. I don't know if Gary Patterson has just held back TCU for the last half decade or however it may be, but this is the best that TCU's looked. And quite frankly, I hate to wait. I might as well wear the hoodie right now, but since they beat Wisconsin in that Rose Bowl back in 2010, they had an undefeated regular season. And when TCU came into the Big 12, they only came in the Big 12, I believe it was 2013. And I think people saw TCU as a team where, like, yeah, they're really good. They had that Rose Bowl. They made the Fiesta Bowl the year prior, I believe it was. And I think everybody thought that they were going to be an Oklahoma shadow. They were going to be a Texas shadow. But what Sonny Dykes has done, he just came from SMU, going literally, 45-minute drive west to Fort Worth to TCU. And just something about that culture just changed. He's a big Spring, Texas guy to, he's from rural Texas. Like if you found out where he was from, you'd be like, that's a part of Texas that nobody knows exists, to be quite frank with you. But he's got the city of DFW behind him. He knows the area. Recruiting really was never an issue with him. And it's like you said, he brings in all these transfers that I think they could buy into what he does. And you see him in press conferences, you see him in sidelines. Like he may not be your typical young guy head coach that we're seeing a wave of, but he's a very down-to-earth ball coach that, a glorified Texas high school coach. People that live in Texas, they know what kind of person he is. That was fantastic. And I think another great thing that we need to talk about is Max Duggan. You said it, Chandler Morris was starting quarterback for TCU to start the season. I remember I had a tweet out there, and maybe I'll get Adam to post a screenshot, but I literally said a tweet that during Big 12 media days, somebody said that they picked TCU to win the Big 12. And I was like, a Max Duggan offense winning the Big 12? Are you serious? We're going to buy into that. And here he is, made it to the Heisman finals, went to New York, only got beat out by someone who was probably a top 2-3 Heisman favorite candidate anyways. So Caleb Williams, he obviously takes the Heisman, but I think Max Duggan, I think he's got the most to be proud for. He would have had my pick for Heisman just because of the expectations that will come. The fact that nobody picked TCU. TCU, I think preseason was fourth or fifth to pick to finish in the Big 12. They win the whole thing. They beat Texas. They beat Oklahoma. They beat Oklahoma State. Remember that game that they played against Oklahoma State? People thought that was going to be a repeat in the Big 12 title game. And after TCU beats Oklahoma State just falls off the cliff the rest of the year. I mean, I don't know what they did to Oklahoma State, but it just decimated them for the rest of the year. And I just think TCU, while the defense has obviously been lackluster, Max Duggan's been among the most efficient quarterbacks in the country. I would probably trust him. And remember, he's not even a Texas guy. He's from Iowa, So if you're an Iowa Hawkeyes fan or Iowa State and you see your quarterback play this year and you see Max Duggan do all this here in Texas, you've got to want to jump off a cliff or something, because this guy, a Midwest guy, came to Texas and he has essentially revolutionized an entire program.
Shout out to Garrett Riley for stepping in his first season, coming along with Sonny Dykes from SMU, taking over as the OC. And Max Duggan is just like a completely different quarterback with this new system. And the biggest part of it to me is just his accuracy on passes downfield. Like it's just a complete vertical attack that nobody's really been able to stop all year long. I think he's got 17 touchdown passes of 20 plus yards, which is the best in the Power 5, second in the FBS. I think only behind it's leaving my mind, but I know he's one of the best downfield passers in the country. And against a Georgia defense that, not gonna lie, has looked a little bit vulnerable the last few weeks. They've given up some big plays spotted all season long. Still a very good unit. I'm not trying to say that it's a bad unit or anything, but at times has given up the big play. They're going to have to be on their A game against Max Duggan and Quentin Johnston, and hopefully Kendre Miller's healthy. It looks like he's going to be there on Monday night.
Yeah, I think so too. I mean, my big thing with Georgia right now, I was going to go into it. I mean, they've allowed 500 passing yards to LSU in the SEC title game. They allowed 350 to CJ Stroud right now. I mean, is this what Georgia is when they play outside of Athens? I mean, not even a healthy Hendon Hooker and Jalen Hyatt could get this type of speed on Georgia. And this Georgia team just all of a sudden, for some reason, it just does not look anywhere near the same. I am a firm believer that if you play on the biggest stage, you do reach, you are going to play your full potential, especially on the offensive side. But this is honestly getting a point where you look at Georgia, it's like they're coming into this game as a 14-point favorite, 13.5 to be exact. I'm kind of just like, if you're noticing the speed that TCU did, the most points ever scored in the college football playoff semifinal by a team, and you're going up against a Georgia defense that has allowed close to 900 yards in their last two games on passing. I don't know how you look at Georgia's defense right now and you look at what TCU is doing. This TCU team is hot. Max Duggan's playing great. Quentin Johnston's playing great. I think Kendre Miller, we'll see how his health is. But if the passing game is clicking, and if they have their linebackers playing off the front seven, what opportunities is Kendre Miller going to get? Everything about TCU is looking on the up. Now Stetson, he played great, but now it's so weird because now we're looking at Georgia and it's like, if they get off to a slow start, how are they going to keep up with TCU's passing attack?
It's almost kind of vice versa. Like, you can't really fall behind against a team like Georgia that, it feels like when they get a lead on you, their defense plays better when the offense is out there just building the lead. And the most uncharacteristic thing about the Peach Bowl was how much time CJ Stroud had. And even when he kind of ran out of time and they blitzed him and they brought a bunch of rushers at him, he was still getting out of the pocket and getting the ball out quickly, which is something Max Duggan has done a lot all season long.
And honestly, that's another thing that we got to talk about. CJ Stroud really has been a pocket passer this whole season. For some reason, I don't know what it was against Georgia. He looked more mobile against Georgia than at any point he has in his last 2 years at Ohio State.
Which is crazy because that's like one of the most talented defensive fronts in college football. And here he is, rushing like he's, like an Aaron Rodgers prime, sort of thing where he's just getting out of the pocket and making throws on the run with ease. And I was like, where was this? And against Georgia of all teams, but we know Max Duggan can do that. We know he can, scramble and get yards as he's done all season long. I think he's close to 2,000 yards in his career rushing, if I'm not mistaken. So, Jaden Daniels is a guy that they can kind of look at as, okay, we've faced a quarterback that can bruise us running the ball with his legs and throwing on the run. So let's kind of defend Max Duggan like we did him. But at the same time, you're talking about guys like Quentin Johnston and Darius Davis that LSU didn't really have the speed like that. Nobody in the college football world has speed like TCU.
No, it's absolutely true. And, and I think the crazy thing about this whole thing is, with TCU, I don't really think anybody expected this type of offense to break out with them. Like, we knew Quentin Johnston was a great, wide receiver going into the season. Some people had him, I think in our top 5, I think some people had him in top 5, but the way that he was able to break out, remember, he had a slow start to the season. I think it was like after 3 or 4, maybe 5 games, he wasn't even top 2 receiving. I mean, it was Darius Davis and Tay Barber that were ahead of him on those receiving yards lists, but now he absolutely explodes in the second half of the season. And he might be playing better than any wide receiver right now in the country. Also, not to mention, it's kind of what we said about, about like how well CJ Stroud played. It was so funny that earlier that day during the Sugar Bowl between Alabama and Kansas State, I mean, Bryce Young played absolutely phenomenal. And right after that game, everybody's saying Bryce Young, quarterback 1 for the NFL draft. There's absolutely zero debate. Here comes CJ Stroud, goes up against what has been the best defense in college football all year, and he absolutely lights them up. I mean, every player is playing great on the biggest spotlight, except if you're on the defensive side of the ball.
So here's the really interesting thing about the way this Georgia team is playing right now, because we mentioned the defensive struggles, if you want to call it. There are some lapses at times, and again, we're replacing a lot of talent, NFL talent, a lot of guys out there that are starting for the first time. But again, a lot of them have stepped in really well. But the thing about this Georgia team that's so interesting compared to last year is the offense is picking up the slack. Like LSU, they dropped 50, they dropped 42 against Ohio State, and they made plays in the clutch when it mattered. Obviously, the LSU game, that game was, a 20-point spread, a margin, but LSU kind of scored in the last few seconds. It wasn't that close. But the Ohio State game, the offense really carried the day, even though Ohio State's offense was right there with them. And that was just something that we didn't see really from the 2021 team. Not that we needed to. I mean, that defense was shutting everybody down. So the Georgia offense is something that TCU is really going to have to keep an eye on more than people might have expected coming into the year.
It's also how clutch Stetson Bennett's been playing too. And full credit to him. Like, I got to be honest with you, I thought you could have picked almost any of Georgia's linebackers to make it to New York instead of Stetson, and it's no disrespect to Stetson, but with all due respect, you only had 1 more touchdown pass in the regular season than Graham Mertz did. Okay, you had 20. That's not, that to me, that just doesn't scream Heisman, material to me. But he knows how to close out games, and I give Stetson full credit to that. He knows how to end games when they need to be, and Georgia does not win against Ohio State without how well Stetson Bennett came back in that fourth quarter, back when Ohio State had like an 87% chance to win that game. And full credit to Stetson, full credit to Dominic Blaylock. I mean, that dude was borderline 5-star. I mean, I know he only had 1 catch, but he had a big catch in that game. That dude was a borderline 5-star back in 2018, and here he is back on the national title. And Arian Smith, he doubled his touchdown catch in one. Sorry, he doubled his total receptions in one game than he did all season. He had 3 all season, and then he has 3 in the semifinals. So, shout out to Georgia. I mean, look, they're not getting the most experienced guys, the most seasoned guys making plays out there, but it's what Kirby Smart's done. I think Ringo was a 3-star guy coming out of high school. I think Jordan Davis, he's now in the NFL. He was a 3-star guy coming out of high school. Kirby Smart knows his guys. He knows the gritty guys, and he knows how to develop every player that's on his roster.
Absolutely. Ringo actually was a 5-star guy. I believe he was the top corner.
There was some player on the Georgia's defense this year that was 3-star, but
yeah, for sure. And one thing that I think we really need to give credit to Kirby Smart and that staff for is their ability to develop guys and keep guys there. And it's kind of crazy to talk about that in today's college football. Or college football in general, because in years past, that was kind of the norm, was you bring guys in as freshmen and you let them sit behind, seasoned starters, potential NFL guys, and then they get their chance. But now, in the world of the transfer portal, Georgia didn't bring in a transfer coming into the season, which is bonkers to think about. And they're very proud of that. And they made it back to the national championship game. I don't want to say because of that. I mean, obviously they've done a phenomenal job on the recruiting trail, as good as anybody, but they didn't need the transfer portal, to get to this point. TCU obviously utilized it very, very well. But they also have guys that are homegrown as well, which is credit to Gary Patterson, who I think obviously set the, kind of wrote the blueprint for this TCU program coming into this matchup.
Yeah, most definitely. I mean, I think, everything that Georgia's doing right now, aside from defense, I mean, they're gritty guys. That's kind of really the best way to describe them. I mean, look, they're obviously going to be top 2, top 3 in recruiting classes every year, but it's always the players that you least expect that come out. I mean, remember, this was a school that recruited Justin Fields coming out of high school. I mean, that was back when Justin Fields was the number 1 recruit in the country. He barely plays for Georgia at all, leaves after his freshman year. I think guys like Aaron Murray was one of the top quarterbacks in his recruiting class. And now here we go. Now we got a guy, Stetson Bennett, who was born in the 90s, which is now considered old in college football. And he's being the undisputed leader of that team right now.
Yeah, as a couple of 90s guys, as we're talking about guys that are old being born in the 90s, that hit me a little different. But we talked about it a little bit. Biggest X factor for each team in the national championship game.
So for me, it's, I think Georgia's got to cover the deep ball. I think that's the most important thing right now. The thing with TCU is they have been tremendous in terms of throwing the ball downfield. I think something we need to talk about is we've already spoken about Georgia's defense. They've allowed 398 passing yards to Ohio State, 274 to LSU. I may have misspoken about that. But then listen to some of these offenses that they had to play. Their best defensive performance were against Georgia Tech, Kentucky, and I'm sorry, I'm not buying on the Will Levis hype. I mean, back when they played Will Rogers, they allowed 289 yards. It's kind of starting to feel like a theme of, okay, Georgia, we know that you're good against some of these underwhelming SEC East teams. But now you're going up against somebody who I think was the most efficient quarterback in the country this year, against a really good receiving core. And you gave up a ton of plays to Marvin Harrison Jr., Julian Fleming. And now it's starting to look like, are we seeing cracks? Are they exposed? And I know Doug and Brian may get on me about this, but I'm looking at Georgia's defense right now, and I'm just thinking to myself, you've allowed a lot of guys open on the outside, and it's been really imminent. And I really hate to put Georgia on fraud alert, especially on the defensive side. But if you just break down film, the corners are playing soft, the safeties are playing, off their man, especially when they're playing cover 2. And did you see that one practice clip of Kirby Smart when he says, y'all been playing really soft right now, or something like that? I think he needs to get that message into the secondary's heads right now, because that's exactly what they are. I mean, they're softer than my toilet paper roll downstairs. I mean, they're not playing tough. They're leaving guys open, And it's honestly really starting to get concerning.
You also got to, there's a couple things in mind. I'm not disputing anything that you're saying because I think it's completely valid, but you got to think about this. They are the reigning national champions that had an insanely good defense last year. Those two things right there put a giant target on your back, and you will be getting the best of every opponent. Look at Kent State and Missouri. I mean, Kent State, I think they had a second half lead over Georgia, which Kent State didn't really have a great season. Missouri was up by 10, I think, at halftime over Georgia. Like, you're going to get the best of just about every, except for Oregon, unfortunately, just about the best performance of any team that you're going to face. And LSU, Tennessee, Ohio State, those are talented offenses against a defense that hadn't really played a lot together coming into the season. So I'm not disputing what you're saying. I think it's super important to point out that there definitely are lapses in this defense, and you cannot have that against such an explosive, probably the most explosive offense in college football. But the thing is, with the passing offense for TCU, as dangerous as that is, they still will kill you in the run game too. With Duggan, with Miller, DeMercado had a great game stepping in for Kendre Miller against Michigan. Like, I think TCU, if I'm remembering this right, TCU and Oregon were the only two FBS teams averaging, I think it's at least 250 passing yards and 200 rushing yards. And they had 30 passing touchdowns, 30 rushing touchdowns, which is just insane to think about out of 131 FBS teams. TCU can do it all, and you have to defend every bit of it. And frankly, nobody's done that yet this year.
All right, what's your X factor for the game?
Honestly, I think TCU's defense, you talked about Georgia's, I think TCU's defense takes a little bit of time. It takes some time to settle into games, which is a good reason why they have so many numbers where they've rallied from this deficit and they pulled off this comeback. And it just seems like every single headline from a recap article from TCU was like rallies and, uses spectacular and miracle and all that sort of stuff, because that's just the way this team is. Sometimes the defense will falter in the first half and the offense has to carry in the second half. You cannot do that against the talent on Georgia's team. Offensively, especially, and you just can't fall behind against a defense that hasn't really turned up the football over a lot. But they get stops on third downs and they get stops in the red zone. They're the best red zone defense in the country. And TCU, if your defense is allowing red zone stops, you're just going to keep falling behind. If your defense is allowing touchdowns in the red zone against Georgia, who is unstoppable in the red zone pretty much. Your offense is going to have to carry the load, which I think Max Duggan, if he's going to get this win, he's going to have to rely on his defense, which is something he really hasn't had to do. And he's going to have to play superhuman, in my opinion. But we'll get to some predictions later on.
So a couple things that I want to point out to you, because I totally agree 100% on what you're saying on TCU, but I just want you to listen to a couple of these stats. You still allowed 528 total yards to Michigan last week.
Yeah.
That's honestly the truth. You allowed over 200 yards rushing to Kansas State in the Big 12 title game. You allowed 500 total yards to Baylor. And I'm sorry, but that Baylor team has been a roller coaster all year. They did get hot towards the middle to the end, but that was the Baylor's offense was not the reason why they turned around. It's because they had great defense. You still allowed 430 yards to West Virginia in Morgantown earlier this year. And that was a West Virginia team that honestly looks like a dumpster fire most of the year. There's a reason why JT Daniels went to his 11th school since becoming a quarterback. Okay. And 386 yards to Oklahoma State. I know Spencer Sanders got good, but this was still not a great, offense that went up. And 540 yards to Kansas. This TCU team, look, they have the offense. They have the speed to get into games. And I think right now with Georgia, I think Georgia is the better team in terms of that they can limit time of possession on their side. They can obviously run the ball. They can control the clock a lot better than what I think TCU can. And while I do think Kendre Miller is a fantastic player, and I know he's a great runner of the ball, and if he's healthy, he's probably going to be the best running back on the field, there's just something about a Georgia identity. And maybe it's their strength of defense that they've had for so many years now. Maybe it's the fact that they could run the ball effectively every game, it seems like. They just know how to control tempo of games, and they probably do that better than any team in the country.
Absolutely. And TCU, they rely on like we talked about, downfield stuff, big pass plays. And you have to think about, you talked about Kirby Smart saying, hey, you're soft, you're playing soft. I'm sure some things are going to get cleaned up. This is the national championship game. I mean, I'm sure they read the scouting report on all the downfield stats, and they've done, 1,020,000+ plays. And I think they have like a total of around 10 touchdowns of 60+. It's absolutely insane what they've done on offense this year, but I'm not expecting Georgia to come out unprepared. But Georgia's offense, if they put up, a couple touchdowns in the first few drives, if their defense forces turnovers, which is something that Georgia's defense hasn't really done a lot of this year, if they force turnovers and give that offense a short field, it might be a long day for TCU, and they might have an even bigger deficit than they've had to come back from, than they've had all year, because TCU, they've taken good care of the ball. You talked about Max Duggan's efficiency. He's taken good care of the ball. Did have 2 picks against Michigan, but they've taken relatively great care of the ball, got a +9 turnover margin. Georgia's at a -2, which is kind of hard to believe for a Georgia team in the national championship game. So have we covered the X factors? I know there are a ton. I mean, these teams are loaded.
There's a lot to talk about on both sides for both teams, but I'm excited to hear what you got to say about Georgia's X factor, because I saw it in the outline and it's pretty interesting. I think it's something that not a lot of people know about.
Yeah, I mean, well, for one, I think it's Georgia's ability to finish, and I'm not saying they have trouble with finishing games. They haven't had any issues. Obviously, they're undefeated, have won, I believe, 16 games in a row. But TCU can give them a taste of their own medicine. We talked about it. Every headline is, oh, they rallied from this. Oh, they came back from that, which against Michigan, they didn't have to do. They led the entire game, never trailed, never tied, nothing like that, which was pretty rare for that TCU team. But the other thing is they need to get pressure on Max Duggan, and they need to get to him quickly, because he can get the ball out and he can scramble. So you have to get to him before he can make a decision. It's too dangerous to give him a lick of time because he's too quick. But the one that you're probably mentioning here is that Georgia has technically the 3rd worst punt return defense in the country in terms of average, because they average 18.3 yards per punt return. Now, let me preface this. This stat is way flawed because they've only allowed returns on 6 punts all season long. They just don't give up returns on punts. They've done a phenomenal job. One of those was a 63-yard punt return touchdown against Mississippi State. So that will skew the average a ton. However, Darius Davis is one of the best returners in college football, whether it be kickoffs, whether it be punts. He's 5th in the country in return yards combined. So you have to contain him, because if he gets a little bit of space, there's few players in college football that are faster. But the last one I wanted to mention, and you mentioned him earlier because I'm glad you did, is Arian Smith. The guy has very little volume throughout his career. He's a redshirt sophomore, but he's averaged almost 35 yards a catch. Like, the dude just makes huge play after huge play, gets good separation, good size. 7 of his 11 catches are for 30 or more, 4 are for 50 or more. We talked about the big touchdown against Georgia. He had another 40-something yarder in that, against Ohio State. Had another 40-yarder in that game too. He just comes up clutch, and I feel like they need to give him some more volume. I think we could see like a Chris Matthews Super Bowl kind of performance out of him.
I mean, no, I mean, you kind of disrespected me because I remember I drafted Chris Matthews in my fantasy draft in 2015, and that was an absolute disaster. But in terms of my aspect of what the X factor is for Georgia, is how well can you run the ball on TCU's? Because TCU's run defense, it's been very, I don't know if streaky is the right word, but it's been very poor. Let's go ahead, just be honest with you. We know how well Georgia can control that they can control the ball when they run the ball. I mean, when you got good players like Kenny McIntosh, who only had 5 attempts against Ohio State, which is insane. I mean, he had 70 yards. He averaged 14 yards a carry. I mean, he still got 5 catches for 6 yards. Got himself a touchdown that game. We got Dejon Edwards, who ran 8 attempts for 58 yards for 7 yards per carry. TCU, listen to some of these stats. TCU allowed 205 rushing yards to Kansas State. They allowed 186 rushing yards to Michigan last week. You allowed 232 to Baylor. You allowed 189 to Texas Tech. You allowed 158 to Kent State. You allowed 155 to West Virginia. Some of these games are games where we saw them struggle the most. West Virginia, they had an early deficit. Okay, Texas Tech, they struggled. They had an early deficit. That game was looking like that game almost looked like a guarantee that TCU was going to be their first loss of the season. Ironically enough, the game this season where they played the best rush defense, ironically enough, it was against Texas when they allowed only 28 yards to Texas. But, I think that was because that was a bit of a Quinn Ewers game. Texas staff, they were trying to get a lot more into the passing. But this has been a TCU defense where, you could run on these guys. And I would really love to see Georgia try to play the classic Georgia style of offense that we all know and love, just try to run down through people's throats. And if Georgia can get a good enough rushing attack where they can average just 5 yards a carry and play this as slow of a game as they can, I really think that this game can go into Georgia's favor to win this game.
It's kind of surprising that TCU has struggled rushing, stopping the run, because they've got some dudes in their front seven. Like Dylan Horton is an animal up front, and Jamoy Hodge, Johnny Hodges, Mark Perry can come down and stop the run. Like they've got guys that can do it, and they showed out at times against Michigan. But it's like for every time they put him behind the chains, they're giving up another big play on the ground. So that's definitely going to be a big.
Maybe this is the one thing that they missed from Gary Patterson. They made a deal with the devil. You get a new fresh offense in here, and the next thing you know, you lost your identity for the last 10 years.
Absolutely. Yeah. And Georgia, you talked about it. They have so many different guys that you have to prepare for. And Kenny McIntosh was the guy who probably should have made a little bit more of a difference than he did in that game. But, he pulled a Daniel Jones and tripped on his feet and fell on his face, unfortunately. So the score probably should have been a little bit bigger than it was in that game.
I will say this. I was writing, I think it was the Tennessee-Georgia game for our game of the week earlier this season. And I made something very notable about Georgia's group of running backs. I think up to that point, they only had one running back that whole season that rushed for over 100 yards. But it's not because they have one lead guy, and that was Kenny McIntosh from earlier in the season. But that was, I think it was against Florida that he pulled that off against. But they have a good stable of running backs. A lot of them have very similar, running styles. And that kind of what makes Georgia tricky to play against. When you have, different groups of guys that all have the same, type of playing field, it makes it that much harder, because before you realize it, you're going to get the same guy again and again and again. You're limiting these touches by these Georgia running backs. You're essentially getting fresh legs almost every run that you're getting.
Yeah, and you think about it, it's so weird to have like a running back by committee at Georgia, because it always feels like they've got top guys, Todd Gurley, and even last year or years prior, they had Zamir White and James Cook, who were still kind of that running back by committee thing. You had Nick Chubb and Sony Michel. It's just weird to see them handing it off to so many different guys when we're so used to seeing like one lead guy. But it's effective. I mean, it works. It's 100% effective, unless Kenny McIntosh falls on his face. But let's move on just a little bit. I want you to complete the sentence here, and we're going to start moving into prediction territory. Georgia wins the national championship if
they stick to running the ball. And I know it's like beating a dead horse at this point, but this is kind of how Georgia was able to limit Alabama's chances last year. Also, they were able to limit Bryce Young's opportunity onto the field. I think, while I'm not going to say that Max Duggan is the same type of quarterback, there's still some similarities to how those offenses operate. And I think the more you keep Max Duggan off the field and the more clock you consume, I think I should have finished that sentence off with Georgia wins if they get, let's just say, 38 minutes time possession. I mean, that's still a pretty skewed time right there. But I think as long as you get Max Duggan, Quentin Johnson, Kendra Miller off the field, I think Georgia should stick to playing chess when they're on offense.
Yeah, and for me, Georgia wins the national championship if they convert in the red zone and they score touchdowns in the red zone. Like, you have to absolutely convert, which has not been a problem for them. I mean, they lead the country in offensive red zone efficiency on offense and defense, 75 of 77 in the red zone, which is insane to think about. 52 of those 75 scores are touchdowns. So we saw what Michigan did in the Fiesta Bowl. They had a couple red zone trips. One of those, probably should have been a touchdown by Roman Wilson, where he was falling backwards and then collected the ball. And then they followed at the 1 yard line on the next play. They were screwing around in the red zone. I'm not going to lie to you. It was kind of a joke what they were trying to do in the red zone with the Philly special thing on the first drive and the
that
fumble.
was embarrassing.
Like they weren't taking it seriously. And you have to against a TCU team that can score in a blink, as we saw in the third quarter when both teams scored 8 gazillion points in like 20 minutes. So you have to convert in the red zone. Georgia has not had a problem with that, but you just have to make sure that you convert, and you have to make sure that you call the right plays and you call, timely stuff, because running the ball on first down and running the ball, inside the 1 yard line, don't get cute. So that's the big thing that Georgia cannot do, which they don't do. Kirby Smart's not, he's not a goofball. He's not going to mess around in a game like this. Yeah. So don't expect them to mess around inside the 10, but they just have to convert because, TCU.
No Philly specials in this game, please. All right.
No.
Like,
unless you're up by like 20, which, even then.
Still, though, you're still showboating at that point.
And then on the flip side, TCU wins the national championship if
they force Georgia to play catch up. The best thing that could happen to TCU in this game is they win the coin toss and they probably score within 2 minutes. Maybe slight exaggeration. But what I'm trying to say is I think TCU, I know what you're saying. Okay, it'll be harder to come from behind against Georgia than what it is against Texas Tech or West Virginia. Okay, I'm not denying that. But what I am trying to say is I think TCU, they have an offense that's more equipped to essentially force the other team to catch up. While Stetson Bennett's been playing great, and while we do have confidence in their running game, I do not trust them enough to get 7 on every single drive the same way that I do with TCU once they're on the field. Listen, if you were to project or simulate TCU's offense against Georgia's defense, the way it's been playing the last 2 games, and then Georgia's offense playing against TCU's defense, which one would you trust to score more? Not score more, but to score first and more efficiently, and again and again and again. You're probably going to take TCU, even with that talented Georgia defense, to scoring more frequently than what you would with Georgia's offense against TCU's defense, even if they're lackluster against the run. Right now with TCU's offense, if they can get on the scoreboard early and force Stetson to try and catch up, I think this falls much more in favor for TCU than it does for Georgia.
It's kind of like a repeat performance of the Fiesta Bowl, essentially.
Yeah. I mean, to be fair, the thing is, though, is I expect Kirby, and, I know Todd Monken isn't exactly a favorite, especially since his time as a Falcons OC, but I still I think Georgia plays smarter on offense, even though we literally just mentioned the Philly special. There were just so many times that you saw Michigan on that offense side of the ball, and you're like, what the hell are you doing? For one thing, it was like the first drive for Michigan, and J.J. McCarthy was diving at the wrong pylon.
Yeah. And speaking to the start, and I'll get into, my statements for both teams in a sec, but speaking to the first quarter specifically, Georgia's only allowed 30 first quarter points all season long. And TCU, that's one of their better quarters. They scored, I think it's 10.6 points a game in the first quarter. It's definitely going to be a battle in the first quarter as much as it is in the fourth quarter, just to see who gets off to what kind of start and who has to come back and all that sort of thing. Because both these teams have done it all season long at times, not all season long in TCU's case. Georgia's done fine, I think, taking care of who they need to take care of. But at times you have had to see them rally back and put together drives. And the thing that's so interesting to me is I talked about how fast TCU's offense can score, but in that Big 12 championship game where they were trailing, they were putting together methodical, long, 8-10 play drives to get down there and tie the game and send it to overtime. So they can wear out the clock and use that time of possession. Kansas State's defense, there are some holes in that defense as well, but I wouldn't be surprised if TCU tried to wear out run at the clock a little bit if they've got a lead. Because I think they can do it with a solid run game with DeMercado and Kendre Miller. So obviously we know the capabilities of scoring quickly, but they can do it real slow too. It's definitely in their capabilities. And we've seen teams do it against Georgia.
So I will say this, and I want to give a special shout out to our guy Dan, Mizzou alum. But what you saw Georgia struggle in that first half against Missouri towards the earlier part of the season, that's truthfully when you start to see a bit of a blueprint of how, Georgia can look vulnerable. I mean, if Mizzou actually would have had a pulse on an offense, that could have been Georgia's first loss of the season. And it's honestly not the only time we saw that. I mean, Kent State I don't want to say Kent State tried to figure it out, but there were times in that first half where, like, when Georgia was struggling to get on the board, if Georgia doesn't get on the scoreboard, they start to look like they're going to capitulate. There were times in those first halves where you looked at them, they were like, they didn't look like a national title team. And it's not because they weren't scoring points. It was because there was a lack of identity on the offensive side of the ball. You take that away from Georgia against what TCU is. You take TCU's offense in those scenarios, like put them on that Missouri team, just replace the players with the jerseys. That is probably truthfully a 28-point win for Missouri at that point when you compare about what those two offenses are about.
One of the biggest difference with those two games and really that patch of the season for Georgia, when a lot of people are like, hey, this is not a number one team. The biggest thing, they were turning the ball over a bunch in the first half. I think they had 2 first half turnovers in both those games you mentioned. And then they were settling for field goals rather than touchdowns when they got into the red zone, which in the last few games has definitely flipped. They're scoring touchdowns when they get there. But for me, I think Georgia wins. TCU wins. I mentioned this earlier. If Max Duggan plays a superhero performance, and he didn't have to against Michigan in the Fiesta Bowl, he really didn't. He played well, but yeah, he did turn the ball over a few times. And, they were carried by the run game. They had the 2 return touchdowns, which gets me to my next thing. I think they can win if they get a return touchdown, whether it be special teams. We've seen, like I mentioned, Georgia gave up one against Mississippi State through a punt return, or a defensive return touchdown, whether it's a fumble recovery or a pick six. Stetson Bennett has taken great care of the football, but I feel like this TCU defense has really shined when it gets and forces turnovers and gets its offense short fields. But lately it's been capitalizing from those touchdowns. That was a big part of the Michigan win, because otherwise I don't think they would have won that game if they didn't have those 2 return touchdowns. Well, the last thing I think we should talk about here, and it's a big debate in the world now with, the Nick Sabans of the world. Everybody wants to replace Nick Saban in Alabama. So if Georgia gets this second in a row for the first time since Bama did it in 11 and 12, can we call Georgia a dynasty? Do you think it's safe to call them that?
It's honestly so difficult to define what a dynasty is these days, and it's entirely Nick Saban's fault. I mean, we're talking about only a second consecutive national title victory for Georgia, and we're already calling it a dynasty. I mean, that is the type of precedence Alabama has put on college football for the last 13 years. I mean, I was looking up, I was thinking about this question earlier, and I was thinking, what was the last true dynasty that we saw in college football before Nick Saban came to Alabama? And my first instinct was Tim Tebow's Florida, with Urban Meyer. That was the first thing that came to mind. And then they've won. They won 2. They won in 2006 and they won in 2008. And I was thinking, okay, USC, they only, correct me if I'm wrong, but I think it was also only 2. And we were talking, I'm saying only 2 like it's a bad thing. Like, I would like to just see a 1 from my team, okay, just once in my life. But I think whenever you compare it to some of those other teams that we've seen before in the past, you kind of have to. But the issue is you can't really categorize Georgia the same way that you can categorize these other teams. USC has Matt Leinart, Reggie Bush, Lendale White, those guys. You've got Florida, which I'm going to say the Tim Tebow, Urban Meyer cheater, and a guy with the initials of AH, because my Catholic side thinks I went to hell if I mention his full name. And that one receiver that used to play for the Eagles that got in trouble outside of a concert. Oh my God, that was a terrible, horrible human being of a team. But when you look at this Georgia team, while you do have Stetson, last year Georgia had some struggles, figuring out who their quarterback was for a while. And then Stetson, even though he came on second week of the season last year, they were still switching every once in a while. And you look at this current Georgia team, you get so many guys go to the draft last year. I think it was 8 defensive players total for Georgia last year that got drafted. You got James Cook and Zamir White at running back who go to the NFL draft. The leading receiver for Georgia this year is Ladd McConkey, some white plantation name type that I think I've ever seen in my life. I mean, this really speaks more about Kirby Smart than what the players are at Georgia. This is, it really talks about how much Kirby has changed the culture. Some people thought the Mark Richt firing when he got let go was stupid because he was a guaranteed 9 wins a year. You bring in Kirby Smart, he's borderline guaranteed 12 wins a year. This is his program. I mean, he's a Georgia guy. He played at Georgia, and whenever you hear him talk, like that's literally the most Southern Georgia person you've ever seen in your life. It's Kirby Smart's Georgia. Like, it's not a player's Georgia, if that makes sense. Like, you got so many talented players that thrived underneath him. You think of those USC teams, you think of Matt Leinart and Reggie Bush. You think of that Florida team, you think of Tim Tebow. If you even want to take it a step further, like, while I wouldn't call him a dynasty, obviously, you think of LSU, you think of Jamar Chase, and you think of Joe Burrow. You think of what Georgia's done the last 2 years. If they win this thing, you're thinking Kirby Smart first before you think of a specific player. So I think in modern standards, if we're excluding what Alabama's done, yeah, I think you got to consider Georgia to be a dynasty, but it's a dynasty that we haven't really seen before, especially with this NIL era. It's truly led by a head coach more than an individual player or two.
I feel like, I understand the history behind this program, but you can kind of compare it almost to Nebraska in a sense in the 90s under Tom Osborne, because Tom Osborne was a legendary coach who won, I think 12 Big 8 titles, 3 national titles. But when you think of like those teams, I feel like, Mike Rozier won the Heisman, Tommy Frazier was electric, but it feels like for even casual college football or NFL fans, those names aren't really household names as much as the guys that you mentioned. And for me, my dad grew up a Nebraska fan, so those names have been pounded into my head since, I've watched football. But it just feels like from people I've talked to and people on social media, those names are almost forgotten. But Tom Osborne's isn't, because of the impact that he had and the coaching tree that he's created. Funny enough, he actually has a losing record in bowl games, which I didn't realize, but 3 national championships will make up for that. But that was probably one of the last true dynasties before Nick Saban, but I'm not ready to call it a true dynasty. I think that's too big of a word if they win this game. However, I would say it's a dynasty in the making. I think it could be safe to say that the way that they're working through the transfer portal, the staff that they've got in place, they can go into any state, any room, any house in the country and recruit guys, which not a lot of programs can say that they can do that. If you've got back-to-back titles, the recruiting is only going to get better. At some point, you'd think they'd utilize the transfer portal. Not really sure. But Kirby Smart is as good as it gets in college football. I feel like a dynasty is sure to come, especially with Nick Saban aging. I don't really buy into that. But his years are more behind him than they are in front of him. Kirby Smart, I feel like, has taken the baton at this point, but it's too early for me to say dynasty. That's my vision on that.
I will say this. Maybe the best way I could explain it is that they will look like a dynasty compared to the average FBS program. That's kind of the best way I could put it. So many people, especially media and fans, I'm guilty of this. We just want Alabama to just go to sleep at this point. Like, we're just waiting for that day. And while I'm not saying that any of us are true Georgia fans except Doug Bryant, we at least look at Georgia and we can say, like, this is a breath of fresh air to see Georgia. Like, even though it's still SEC, this is still a program that's been knocking on doors for the last 10 years, it feels like, and just waiting to just crash into it and party. And they've finally done it. And that's what made last year feel so good. And that's what even made the 2018 final feel so heartbreaking, even to the average fan. Because, like, when it was Calvin Ridley, correct me if I'm wrong, like caught no, Devontae Smith, stupid. But when Devontae Smith caught that game-winning pass, I think there was a sense of a heart broken among all fans that were just like, why couldn't have that just been the moment that you finally like ended this? And the fact that Georgia, even though they lost to Alabama in the SEC title game last year, they still win the national title game. They win the SEC title game. They have an opportunity to get both in the same year for the first time in the program's history. At least in the last, since they became relevant, it's been really good to see them, and it's really exciting to see what they're going to do, because you just know that Kirby Smart, he's going to be one of those legendary coaches that you hear about that's at a program for 20 plus years. He's been there for just over 5 now, and it's like we still want more. It's not like, oh, I want you to prove it type more. It's like, you've given us so much good product on the field over the last 5 years. We just don't want to see it die.
Yeah, a lot of people, the hatred for Alabama definitely exists outside of Tuscaloosa. But at the same time, if Georgia keeps winning at the rate that they are, I mean, they're 80-15 under Kirby Smart. They're going to get to that hated point too. I mean, it's kind of this never-ending cycle of they're going to hate the best because they're the best, and they just won't go away. And Georgia could be reaching that territory. But I think now that we're wrapping up the show here, I think it's time to get into score predictions and predict, hey, who wins this dang thing? Who wins the Natty?
Why do I got to go first? Anyways, I'll go. I'll go. But oh man, we've spoken about this game from so many angles. I absolutely hate the spread. I don't think TCU loses by 14. I just think that is absolutely outrageous. I think their offense is too good. I still think I like Georgia's, able to control the clock better than TCU right now. I think I would trust them to make a stop late in the game more than I would with TCU. I still think TCU is going to get points on the board. I still think Max Duggan's going to have a great game. I think I'm going to lean towards let's go super high. Let's go 42-38, Georgia.
Wow. Okay. Now, I know we got spoiled with the college football playoff semifinals. We got 2 outstanding high-scoring games. I have a weird feeling that we're going to get kind of a slugfest a little bit in this one. I'm kind of anticipating the opposite a little bit of a low-scoring, I don't want to say defensive battle, because I don't know if DCU is going to throw their hat in the ring if it's a defensive battle. But I'm anticipating a little bit fewer points. So I'm thinking like a 28-20 for Georgia. I think they're going to get, or maybe 28-22. I feel like TCU will, fall behind and maybe go for 2 to try to get back in. And, Georgia's offense will put it away in the last few minutes. But we've talked about it. I trust Georgia's defense to finally get, a big stop. I shouldn't say finally. I think they made some big plays in the Ohio State game, but some timely moments against a TCU offense that has just not been slowed down all year. I think we're going to see the talent really start to bloom with this Georgia defense, because collectively there are not a lot of household names, NFL names that you can just rattle off like you could with last year's team. Of course there are a few, but there are a lot of guys who are pretty new to the average college football fan, and I think they're going to really make a household name of themselves in this game, and TCU is going to have a harder time than they've had in all season long. So I've got 28-22 Georgia in this one. Any final thoughts? This is the last preview we're doing until August. So any last thoughts on this game?
Maybe I got to bring out the Texas side a little bit, but I think something that we should have mentioned, and I forgot to mention it in the whole TCU, what's their story, the recap a little bit. They're the best right now. They've been the best program in the state of Texas. And as far as I'm concerned, the Big 12 is going to do just fine without Texas and Oklahoma. The last 2 years since this announcement's been made, it's been TCU, Oklahoma State, Baylor, Kansas State, essentially running this conference. I mean, we've had 4 different reps in the Big 12 title game in the last 2 years. Neither of them are Texas or Oklahoma. Okay, and I don't know how good Houston, BYU, UCF, and Cincinnati are going to do next year, but there's still loads of talent here in the Big 12. There's still great coaching here in the Big 12. It's going to be just fine. TCU, you've been the best program. Thank you for being the first Texas team to make the playoff the first Texas team in 9 years of this thing to make the playoff and keeping the Big 12 alive.
And they're the first Texas team to compete for a national title and Big 12 team to compete for a national title since Texas in 2009. And yeah, I just think it's funny that we're talking so much about, the Big 12's dying because Oklahoma and Texas are leaving for the SEC in what could be now 2 years, or I guess 1 year. Now they're in 23. And look at TCU in the national championship game, doing just fine. And you mentioned it, 4 different Big 12 championship game reps, and you've got 4 solid programs coming in. So honestly, it's crazy to say it at this point compared to where we were, what was it, a year and a half ago? I think the Big 12 is going to do just fine. I totally agree with you. And it's kind of crazy to believe that we're at this point, but the Pac-12 now seems to be in danger. So, you give and you take.
I'll tell you what, you as a West Coast guy and as an Oregon guy, you get a call from the Big 12, take it.
Will do. Yeah. Because I make those decisions, as we all know. Yeah, I would take it. I mean, Big 10 seems a little far. I like Big 12 country. I'd take that over Big 10 country. I want to go to Texas. Never been.
I mean, hell, I'll take you. I'll do the same thing with you that I did with Liam when he came here. I'll take you to some good barbecue spots.
Maybe some Mexican food. I know they got good Mexican food down there.
Let's see now. I'll tell you this. If you want Tex-Mex, you come to Austin. If you want authentic Mexican, you go to San Antonio. That's just the way I'm going to put it.
Word. Good to know. All right. Well, TCU is going to be well represented in Inglewood, California, a place that TCU is, close to in that area has had success. Sorry to say it, but the last time TCU was in that area, they won the Rose Bowl and finished off an undefeated season. They won't be undefeated if they win the national championship, but they're sure as hell have a lot of respect if they top the reigning champion Georgia on Monday night. So thank you everybody so much for tuning in to this episode of the podcast. If you want some coverage of the FCS championship game on Sunday night, we've got a video up already. We've got some article content coming out very soon on that as well. And make sure to check out our website for FBS National Championship content as well, and all other content covering college football. So thank you everybody for tuning in, and we'll see you in the next one.